Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Exploring Plot Diagrams with me, Mr. DeCafe. And as we all know, if the fires are burning, you are a learning. Today, we're going to be talking about plot diagrams. So you might be asking yourself, wait, what is a plot? And that's a pretty good question. But first, I want you to think of a story. Think of any story. Do you have one? Good. So now you think about that story as, I don't know, maybe a quilt or something along those lines, where it's a big piece put together. And a plot is actually what we take to look at all of those pieces of a story. So far, we kind of have a nice quilt, and we've unraveled it to the point that you're talking about the pieces of a story. But it's important to know the plot isn't just like pieces of a story. It's all of that stitched together into something big, beautiful, a story. Another example you might think of is when we think about the Haudenosaunee and the way they made wampum belts to tell their stories, to tell their history. And this is a really good way to look at it too, because all of those pieces, all of those events come together to make something amazing. Check this one out. This is a wampum of the Five Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee Nations. Um, and it kind of depicts the Great Peace. So yeah, we'll move right along to some more pieces of the plot diagram we're going to be talking about. So here you see the plot diagram I'm going to be explaining today, and there's a few different parts. In very simple terms, you've got an introduction, a rising action, to a climax, down to a conclusion, aka beginning of the story, the interesting parts, the end of the story. And that's basically what a plot diagram is. You're taking that quilt or that wampum and you're just going into each of the pieces to talk about what they mean and what they represent and what's going on. Now, I realize that this has a lot of information on it, and this is just a handout I usually give students when I'm having them explore diagrams. But you know, we're going to go through all of this today, so don't worry about being like, "Wah, pause the button." No, it's all good. So in that introduction, there's a few things that happen right off the bat. You're going to meet your main characters. You're going to find out the setting for the whole world that you're going to be looking at. And you'll be introduced to the conflict of the story. And all of this is going to set the scene and set the whole stage for the rest of the story. So the introduction is the beginning of the story where the reader meets the main characters, glimpses the setting, the where and the when, and of course the conflict and how it relates to the protagonist. And the protagonist is usually the main character of the story. If you're thinking of The Hobbit, you're thinking of Bilbo, or Harry Potter, or even the star of Matilda, Matilda herself. I hope that sets the stage for what an introduction is. There's one more part of the setting that I didn't mention, and it usually kind of becomes obvious, but it's one thing I want you to look at, and that's not knowing that it's not just the where and the when for the setting, but also the mood. And so here you might be thinking, okay, the mood of a story. Is it going to be maybe a happy mood or a sad mood? Maybe it's something a lot more complex. And this is where the introductions can get really interesting because they're going to set a variety of flavors of mood. And maybe it's like more complicated. Maybe the mood is more, you know what, you're trying to juxtapose the difference between learning and not learning. Maybe it's something more like, you know what, this is a love story. Maybe there's other types of moods. Maybe there's other things you're noticing. It's also that feeling that the author sets in the story for how they want you to feel when you're reading their book, or watching their movie, or looking at their quilt. All right, so we've talked about the introduction, talked about the where and the when for the setting, talked a little bit about the mood, and we talked about the characters, in which case we mainly just talked about the protagonist. We also talked about the problem, specifically what the problem is, who is the conflict with, And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in this video. But just so you know, that's where it gets set up. That's where we know in Harry Potter that Harry Potter is living with a Muggle family and there's some sort of evil one who shall not be named, etc. kind of thing. Or with Matilda, we know that the problem is she is exceptionally brilliant and her family not so much. And from here, this is where the story usually gets pretty interesting. And that's where we get to love our characters because we learn to love our characters because we see them doing things. We're not just presented with a really cool person and be like, trust me, they're cool, like in a commercial. Instead, we're seeing them conquer their challenges. We're seeing them rise to the occasion. Get it? Get it? Because it's the rising action. So a lot of stories are going to have lots of events. In this case, we're going to talk about one or two, and usually we'll just talk about the two big ones. And I know at the very beginning of this video, I asked you to think of a story, whatever story you want. So I want you to think of two kind of smaller events that happen from the beginning of the story towards the end of the story that really like show your character. Do you have them? Yeah? Good. So if we're talking about Harry Potter again, just because I'm reading it right now, we might talk about the Sorting Hat. Or we might talk about Harry's first Quidditch match. Now these are two events, but obviously there's tons of other events that happen. Like I said, there can be a lot of rising actions. For this one, you're thinking of just two of them, and that's really difficult for a full novel. Now, if we think of the show or the story you're thinking of, maybe you want to tell me what two events are for that. So just to quickly summarize, rising actions tend to advance the plot. They also provide inciting incidents where we get to see a little bit more of our characters' depths, and also provide a little glimpse into their relationships with supporting characters. So, rising actions are multiple events in a story to advance the plot, provide interest by inciting incidents, where the protagonist can meet supporting characters and build relationships and suspense with them, and ultimately to move the story towards the climax of the story. And this is still like a rising event in that it is still just an inciting event, but it is the one that is like the penultimate part of the story. If we're talking about some stories, it's the most exciting part. If we're talking about, I don't know, crime TV, it's where the handsome detective catches the bad guy. And by that, I mean, obviously, the Scooby Doo gang catches the person impersonating the ghost. Scooby Dooby Doo, where are you? You meddling kids! All right, after the climax, we have the solution. And this is where our characters tend to wrap up the story, reveal the solution, and tend to go back to their normal lives. And so, yeah, for the Scooby-Doo gang, it's them catching the criminal and the police coming and arresting him. For the first book of Harry Potter, it's going back to his Muggle house after he's stopped "He who shall not be named." For Matilda, it's realizing that, you know what? She's going to have a better life with her favorite teacher. And all of that is just the solution. And for that, you have to go back to that problem we introduced in the very beginning. So, a solution is always the answer to that conflict. Sometimes it'll be multiple solutions for multiple conflicts that we've kind of looked at throughout the entire story. But you know what? In the end, we're wrapping up the story. And for me, maybe a problem is that the solution tends to blend into the conclusion. But one of the big things with this is it's still part of the story. The story isn't over yet. In other words, it's basically the falling action, or the denouement, whatever you want to call it, whether it's solution, falling action, denouement. It's the climax of the chain of events. It's after that, it's where everything is made clear. For the Scooby-Doo gang, it's where the criminal tells them why he was doing it. For, other stories, it's where they kind of reveal their motive for the whole conflict. If we return to our quilting metaphor, it's where loose ends are tied up. And you can look back and you can see your whole quilt, your whole piece, and be like, oh, that's delightful. And at long last, we have the resolution, aka the conclusion, or even a return to the new normal. Now, gosh golly, that sounds awfully familiar. Can anybody tell me what that's from? Hint, hint. Possibly the hero's a journey. Woo! More on that another day, though. I just like to reference it because I love it. No matter how you spin it, the resolution or the conclusion is where the story ends. The characters return to their lives. Maybe if it's the end of the first book in the series, you'll get a little bit of a glimpse into the future. So there we have it. The end of our plot is the resolution, the conclusion. It's the end of the story. Characters get to return to normal, whatever that is, and maybe even glimpse into what's next. Dun dun dun! So there you have it. We have a plot diagram. Got our introduction, our rising action, our climax, the solution, and conclusion. And this is just one example of a plot diagram. A fairly simple one. One thing I didn't cover yet is the lesson of the story, or sometimes what we call the theme. And there we have kind of undertones of the story. But you know what? We're not going to get into that right now because that is a whole nother video. And I think it's time to be done. What do you guys think?